This episode is brought to you by Netflix. So Netflix is basically Santa this year. 2 NFL games on Christmas Day, streaming live. At 1 p.m. Eastern, it's Cowboys, Commanders. Then at 4:30, you've got Lions, Vikings. Midwest football, playoff stakes, and probably some snow. Watching holiday football is a tradition the whole family can enjoy. Open some gifts, grab some food, settle in, and watch NFL Live on Netflix this Christmas Day.
Introducing Meta Ray-Ban Display, the world's most advanced AI glasses. With a full color display built into the lens of the glasses, it's there when you need it and gone when you don't. Send and receive messages, translate or caption live conversations, collaborate with Meta AI, and more. Be one of the first to try Meta Ray-Ban Display. Visit meta.com/Meta Ray-Ban Display to book a demo and find your pair.
Support for Ben Franklin's World and the Doing History to the Revolution series comes from the Omohundro Institute, proud publishers of the William & Mary Quarterly, the leading journal of early American history since 1943.
The critical debates on independence in the Second Continental Congress were in early June. And for 2 days, they debated it very seriously. And then essentially they decided that although they seemed to have a majority for it, they really needed to be unanimous. And if they delayed the vote, that they thought they would be closer to unanimity. I mean, you don't go out and fight the greatest military power in the world unless you have your ducks in line, so to speak. What they approved on July 4th was the text. And then they had it printed immediately, the Dunlap broadside, which people can see. It's printed in block letters. There's no signature except John Hancock's name appears on the bottom and Charles Thompson attesting to the signature of John Hancock.
Who served as president of that.
Was the president of the Congress. But you don't see signatures. All you see are the block letters because it's printed. Okay. I mean, it's printed in block letters. That was sent out. That was sent out broadly. So the text of the Declaration was broadly disseminated. This is why, it's possible to say this is a press release. And that's circulated largely domestically. They do send a copy to Silas Deane in France with orders to give it to the French court. But Congress doesn't do it. It's done by a committee, and they do it in the most lackadaisical way imaginable. I mean, they send it on one ship. You don't do that in the 18th century if it's important. Going across the North Atlantic, you put it in 2 ships, Of course, it didn't arrive. It got lost somewhere. It was intercepted. Finally, they sent another one. And by then, Dean was just embarrassed. He said, it's all over the newspapers and I'm supposed to present this to the French court. And you didn't even send it with a seal. They took seals very seriously in the 18th century. So I think that Congress really thought the Declaration originally was mainly for a domestic audience.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 155 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. As the mission of the Doing History to the Revolution series is to explore not just the history of the American Revolution, but the histories of the Revolution, I'm taking the liberty to use this episode to explore the history and histories of the Revolution through the work of a historian I greatly admire. Her name is Pauline Maier. And I happen to know that you admire her too, because over the last 3 years, I received many requests to get Pauline on the show. Now, Pauline was the author of 4 books about the American Revolution and founding of the United States. I first came to her work in late 1998 as a junior in high school. That's when I found her book, American Scripture, Making the Declaration of Independence, on a bookstore shelf. I purchased the book, and then I quickly devoured the book. I just couldn't put it down. I was simply captivated by the way that Pauline took me with her on her journey through how the Declaration of Independence came to be. I mean, Pauline Maier really made history a lot of fun to read. Then in college, I read her first and second books, From Resistance to Revolution and The Old Revolutionaries. The information in these books proved really invaluable to me, as during my summer and school breaks, I worked for the National Park Service as an interpretive ranger at the Boston National Historical Park. It was part of my job to answer a lot of visitor questions about the American Revolution, the Stamp Act riots, the Sons of Liberty, and the old revolutionaries like Samuel Adams. Now, by 2003, I was ready to apply to graduate school, and as I enjoyed reading Maier's work so much, I sent her an email and inquired about the possibility of studying with her at MIT. Pauline replied back with a really long response. She told me that she was really flattered that I had enjoyed her work so much. She told me a bit about what she was working on at the time. And she also told me that I could come work with her at MIT, but that I had to come knowing that I'd have a very hard time getting a job when I graduated because MIT didn't offer a traditional history PhD program. She told me that if I really wanted to be a serious historian with job prospects, I needed to work with someone in a traditional program. I remember getting that email and being a bit sad, but also, how cool was it that Pauline Maier had taken the time to write me back with such a long, thoughtful response? I was really impressed by that, and I should have taken the time to contact Pauline again in graduate school, but I didn't. Still, her last book, Ratification, helped me write the last chapter of my dissertation. And as luck would have it, I would have the opportunity to tell her this in person not long after I finished grad school, because that's when I met Pauline for the first time. After graduation, I moved back to New England and I started attending the Boston Early American History Seminar hosted by the Massachusetts Historical Society. Pauline occasionally attended that seminar. And after one seminar meeting, I finally worked up the courage to finally go talk to this amazing senior scholar whose work I admired so much. And what I found was she was actually really friendly and really interested in talking to me, even though I was like this freshly graduated historian at the time. We went on to enjoy several conversations after seminars. She was just really fantastic to talk to because she was brilliant. She had this amazing command of history and primary sources, and she also had this fantastic sense of humor. Pauline really loved to talk about history and her research, and she'd talk about it with just about anybody who would listen. But then Pauline stopped coming to seminar. It turned out that she had lung cancer, and she died from it in August 2013 at the age of 75. As my Doing History teammates and I outlined the episodes we wanted to create for this series, we lamented time and time again about how much we wished Pauline were alive to participate so that you could meet her, ask her questions, and learn more about her great work. And somehow, during one of these discussions, I got it into my head that we should include her anyway. I mean, why not, right? Pauline may not be alive, but we know historians who knew her and who know her work. So why don't we do an episode with Pauline Maier? So this is it. We're going to explore the American Revolution and how Pauline Maier did history, not through a conversation with Pauline, but through her 4 books with 4 historians. Joining us for this exploration is Mary Beth Norton, Joanne Freeman, Todd Estes, and Lindsay Travinsky. Mary Beth, Joanne, and Todd knew Pauline personally. Lindsay is a recently graduated historian who, like Pauline, works on early American political history. So we'll begin today's journey through the American Revolution as Pauline understood it with Mary Beth Norton. Mary Beth is the president-elect of the American Historical Association and the Mary Donlin Alger Professor of American History at Cornell University. She was also a rough contemporary of Pauline's in graduate school, so she can really help us explore Pauline's early interest in the Revolution and her earliest histories of it. Mary Beth Norton, thank you so much for joining us for this retrospective on Pauline Maier's work on the American Revolution. Now, in 2013, you wrote that you first met Pauline Maier on December 8, 1966. Would you tell us about that meeting?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Actually, you may want to know why I can say that precisely. It's because I kept a diary when I was a graduate student, and I looked up the date when I was asked to participate in a memorial for Pauline at MIT, and there it was in my diary that I had met her. And we met at a history department meeting. We were both teaching at that time, and the teaching assistants were invited to come to certain history department meetings, and that's how we met. And I noted in my diary that I was delighted to finally meet her because I'd heard about her. I'd already been at Harvard for a couple of years, and she had been there several more years. And I was really looking forward to seeing her because we were both working with Balin, of course, but we were also both women, and we were the only 2 women who were working with Balin at the time.
What was it like to be a grad student studying early American history and the American Revolution in particular in the 1960s?
It was a very interesting time to be doing that. We did have the feeling that the field was being remade. I, of course, was kind of an outlier because I was working on the Loyalists, which was different from what Pauline and just about everybody else was doing. They were working on the revolutionaries, but we were all part of the same enterprise, which was trying to rethink the revolution. And it was very important to us to put forward new ideas about the revolution, as it was for our mutual mentor, Bernard Bailyn.
Now, in the introduction to her first book, From Resistance to Revolution, The Colonial Radicals and the Development of American Opposition to Britain, 1765 to 1776, Pauline noted something that you just mentioned, Mary Beth, which is that her book emerged out of her dissertation, which she wrote in the 1960s, those, quote, heady days when a group of Bernard Bailyn's graduate students shared a sense that they, like their master, were contributing to a major reinterpretation of the American Revolution, end quote. Mary Beth, would you tell us about those heady days and how you and Pauline sought to reinterpret the American Revolution from the way it was understood in the 1960s?
Yeah, well, you have to understand that at the time that we were writing, the paradigm that governed the way people thought about the revolution stemmed from the progressive era. It actually, in a lot of ways, went all the way back to Charles Beard, with the idea that American revolutionaries were governed or were motivated entirely by economic motivations. That's a terrible way of putting it, but that their motives were entirely economic, that they were advancing their own interests, and that what they said in their writings was kind of a cover, that they could not have actually believed what they were saying about how Britain was trying to enslave America, that this was all propaganda. And so there was a lot of emphasis, traditional scholarship about the American Revolution, about propaganda and patriot propaganda. I think, for example, of the famous biography of Samuel Adams, basically titled Sam Adams, Pioneer in Propaganda. That's the kind of way that people thought about the revolution and thought about what the Americans were saying in their pamphlets and their newspaper essays. And we disagreed with that. Although, on the other hand, we also thought it had to be investigated. That is, the people who were arguing that the revolutionaries were concealing their true motives didn't ever look really at the revolutionaries' own writings. And so one of the ideas I had for my dissertation, in fact, was to look at the Loyalists' own writings and to compare what they were saying privately among each other or to their patriot relatives to what they were writing publicly, because, of course, there were Loyalist pamphlets also in the American Revolution. And one of the things that we were trying to find out was, are these people right in saying that the revolutionaries were somehow concealing their true motives, which was the standard way that people thought about the revolution up until that period, up until the 60s.
Out of curiosity, what exactly influenced your desire to reinterpret the American Revolution in a way that departed from this progressive era style interpretation of economic and concealed motivations? Was it what was going on with the social movements of the 1960s and 1970s? I mean, did these movements influence the way that you and Pauline viewed the American Revolution?
Well, ultimately, when I got into women's history, it definitely was the social movements of the 1970s, and it was the rise of feminism. But in the 60s, no, it didn't really relate that much to social movements at the time. It related much more to trends in scholarship that were happening in Europe and England. The rise of the studies of the crowd by people like George Roudet, I know that influenced Pauline a lot, because we would talk about that sometimes. She was very interested in looking at the scholarship that developed in England and France about the importance of crowd actions as expressing the people's will at a time when most people didn't have the right to vote, and seeing if that applied in America also.
Since Pauline's first book, From Resistance to Revolution, is the first book where she investigated the role of popular crowd actions in the revolution's course of events, would you tell us about it? In what ways did From Resistance to Revolution contribute to helping us rethink and better understand the American Revolution?
One of the most interesting aspects of Pauline's book, I think, is the way it reinterprets the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty have this reputation of being this very radical group that organized riots in Boston and other cities. What she discovered by looking very carefully at the correspondence of the members of the Sons of Liberty in the different communities was that this was not true at all, that the Sons of Liberty were actually a moderating force and that the Sons of Liberty did not form until after most of the Stamp Act riots of 1765. She discovered that people like Samuel Adams and others who were very active in the Sons of Liberty, Christopher Gadsden in South Carolina and so forth, were very interested in the ability of people to express their opinions publicly, but they did not believe in, shall we say, unrestrained violence. And they were, petty merchants and people of some means. They were artisans. They were not people who were without resources. And they were interested in, shall we say, not controlling or manipulating, but taking leadership roles of the crowds that gathered in colonial cities over issues like the Stamp Act or the Townsend Duties and so forth. To me, that's the message from Resistance to Revolution, that it's a controlled process, that people are interested in ideas. They're interested, for example, in John Wilkes, who was a radical in England, and they supported him. They collected money for him, which caused all kinds of trouble in some of the individual American colonies with local governors in those colonies. They did not like what the Americans were doing in collecting money for Wilkes and seeing him as a martyr to free speech and so forth. She really presented the story of the coming of the revolution in the 1760s into 1775 as an international struggle as seen by the Americans, one that involved going on in England, one that involved a tension that was going on in Corsica. So she linked the concerns of the leaders of the resistance at that time to their ideas about an international movement for freedom, but one that was controlled, one that was not unrestrained. And I said when I started this little comment, the image that we've always had of the Sons of Liberty had always been, sort of radicals in the streets, not concerned about the consequences of their actions. She showed this was utterly not true.
Wow. It really sounds like Pauline must have had to dig into the archives to really find the records of those individuals to tell that story.
Yes, she did. She did a lot of work in individual historical society collections. She certainly spent a lot of time in England. And once I vividly remember a moment when the two of us were researching different aspects of the revolution across the table from each other in the Harvard Library. She was reading documents of revolutionaries and I was reading documents of loyalists. And we traded information back and forth across the table.
One thing that Pauline remarked upon in From Resistance to Revolution was that in the 1960s, many scholars didn't think the American revolutionaries were worth serious study. And today that seems crazy. Mary Beth, why did historians think that the American revolutionaries were not worth studying in the 1960s? I mean, how did they seek to understand the revolution if not through the ideas and experiences of its actual participants?
Well, I think it goes back to what I was saying about the progressive interpretation, because the progressive interpretation basically said that the revolutionaries were concealing their true motives. And so what you wanted to do was not study them, but to say, for example, study what the economy was at the time and what their financial interests were. So this notion that you shouldn't study the revolutionaries meant that you shouldn't study them as individuals with ideas that they were expressing publicly, because their really true ideas were things that they held privately that you could never access. And I think that's why she commented that people did not think the revolutionaries were worth studying as individuals, as people with writings that would be publicly available to people, that would express their motivations.
From the stories you've been telling us, it sounds like you and Pauline were actually in the vanguard of a movement to start studying the participants of the revolution.
Well, I like to think that we were, yes. I mean, my participants were loyalists rather than revolutionaries, but yes, I did do a lot of work on what the loyalists were thinking, and not just what they were doing, but what they were thinking. There had been some previous work on the loyalists about what they had done, but not so much about their thoughts.
Now, over the course of her lifetime, Pauline Maier wrote 4 books. In the preface to her second book, The Old Revolutionaries, Political Lives in the Age of Samuel Adams, Pauline thanked Mary Beth for reading the entire manuscript and for providing feedback before she sent it off to the publisher. Mary Beth, as you are really familiar with Pauline's second book, would you tell us about The Old Revolutionaries?
Yes, it definitely grew out of the first book because she became convinced after studying the period between 1765 and 1775 that the leaders of the, quote, revolution, it's not really that yet, but the leaders of the resistance at that time had been overlooked by subsequent scholars who were looking at, quote, the founding fathers who were, say, the people who fought the war or members of the Continental Congress or who were members of the Constitutional Convention. She thought these people had been overlooked by subsequent people, and so she wanted to write a collection of short biographies to bring those people back to attention. That is, the people who were the real leaders of the resistance in the 1760s. Now, the preeminent one of those was Samuel Adams, but she also dealt with someone like Isaac Sears, who I know, this was a big favorite of hers. She used to talk to me about the Isaac Sears essay. Isaac Sears was a merchant in New York who was quite a radical in the context of New York. Another one she was very interested in was Dr. Thomas Young, who was indeed a physician and brought to his work in the resistance movement a physician sensibility. That is, someone who had some scientific training and education at that time. So it's a very interesting and varied group of individuals that she included in the Old Revolutionaries. It's a series of 5 short biographical studies.
Could we have a preview of one of those studies? Perhaps you would tell us about Pauline's chapter on Samuel Adams, who was this old revolutionary she viewed as being badly remembered by both Americans and historians.
Yes, I'm happy to, because I think that's the one that has had the most impact. For one thing, she insisted and pointed out that he was always known to contemporaries as Samuel, or as I said earlier, one of the famous books of the progressive interpretation was called Sam Adams, Pioneer in Propaganda, and that was the traditional way of seeing him. No one ever called him Sam. And so when I read history today where he's called Sam, I say these people have not fully assimilated the argument that Pauline made, which had to do with how he was perceived by his contemporaries. He was not a man who had very great financial resources. He was an older cousin of John Adams. He had been in and out of debt. He had indeed been a brewer, so there's a reason why a beer is named after him today. He was someone who was deeply committed to the ideology of resistance and revolution and stuck with it, and later on became governor of Massachusetts, but was not a proponent, for example, of the U.S. Constitution when it was adopted. So she understood that he remained wedded to his original ideas and made that point very vividly and very successfully in that essay. I commend it to anyone listening to this. It's very important.
Pauline also noted that a reason she thought Samuel Adams was remembered so badly was because historians and Americans had spent 2 centuries trying to, quote, explain away or simply reject the Revolution of 1776, whose ethic is uncomfortable and whose doctrine remains unsettling in any established nation, including that which it founded, end quote. Mary Beth, why did historians and Americans spend 200 years trying to explain away the Revolution of 1776? I mean, what exactly makes the revolution uncomfortable?
What makes it uncomfortable is the very idea that is expressed at one point by Thomas Jefferson, which is that regular revolutions are necessary. If you've got an established government, you don't want to believe that. You want to think you've solved all the problems. And Samuel Adams knew you hadn't solved all the problems. Samuel Adams was someone who thought he understood that governments had to be regularly renewed and refreshed, as it were, and changed. But once Americans adopted the Constitution, everybody thought, oh, this is it. We don't need to do any more, except perhaps to add a Bill of Rights. He, of course, was a great proponent of a Bill of Rights. So he and the other old revolutionaries who remained true to that faith were written out of the story of subsequent American history.
Many historians in the 1960s didn't think people should study the revolutionaries or the ideas they expressed in their writings. Inspired by Charles Beard's classic 1913 publication, An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution, they believed that the revolutionaries were motivated purely by economic self-interest. Therefore, what could you really glean from reading their papers, pamphlets, and correspondence? I mean, no one would admit to being economically motivated in their public writings. So their public writings must be propaganda, right? This is what those who belong to the progressive school of history thought. But Pauline Maier, Mary Beth Norton, and other historians studying the American Revolution disagreed. They thought that the revolutionaries and those who participated in the revolution were worth studying as people, and that their writings contained not propaganda, but ideas really worth considering. To this end, Pauline went into the archives and explored the lives and ideas of Sons of Liberty members and of the old revolutionaries. Her early work revealed that groups like the Sons of Liberty worked not to promote violent crowd actions, but to moderate them, so that ideas and opinions about the politics of the day could be shared and considered in a public forum without the development of unrestrained violence. She also revealed that we really need to grapple with the uncomfortable fact that revolutions topple governments, and that some of the revolutionaries, like Samuel Adams and Isaac Sears, believed that periodic revolutions were needed and necessary to keep the power of government in check. But no stable government wants to promote the idea of revolution, not even the American government and its people. So slowly but surely, Americans adapted the stories they told in their history books about men like Adams and Sears and their uncomfortable ideas. This is why before Pauline's work, the portraits we have of these men were short and said little about their true political ideas and contributions. But what about the document that helped the revolutionaries declare that they were, in fact, toppling a government to start a new one? What about Pauline's most famous work, American Scripture, Making the Declaration of Independence? We should speak with another scholar who knew Pauline and knows her work well. Joanne Freeman is a professor of history and American studies at Yale University. She's the co-host of the podcast Backstory, a scholar of early American political history, and the author of 3 books, including The Essential Hamilton, Letters and Other Writings, and The Field of Blood, Violence in Congress and the Road to Civil War. So why don't we go pose some questions to Joanne? Joanne, thank you for speaking with us about Pauline Maier. Would you tell us how you knew Pauline and how you became acquainted with her work?
Sure. I think I knew something of her work, but I think the initial way in which she had the biggest impact on me was really for being a woman historian. And let me explain what I mean by that. I had a career in public history before I started grad school. And so my first semester in grad school, I was invited to give a lecture at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington. And I was really excited. But as I was thinking about that, I realized I didn't have in my head any voice of a woman historian kind of holding forth in that kind of a room. So I decided I needed to sort of go out and try and find female historians that I could just watch them in a public situation. Peter Onif was my graduate advisor, and he remains the best graduate advisor on the face of the earth, but he was a big guy. I wasn't going to sound like him. So I ended up finding some event, and I wish I could remember what it was, in Williamsburg, which is not that far away from Charlottesville, where I was. And it was Joyce Appleby and Pauline Maier were both up on the stage. And I thought, here you go. Okay, these 2 senior women, I'm going to go watch and see what they sound like in front of an audience. So I did. And, they're powerful thinkers and very strong personalities. And they really held forth in that room. And the room had a lot of guys in it. And they had absolutely no problem mastering that room and asserting their intellectual powers and moving arguments. So I sat in the audience and thought, that's exactly, that's what I want to sound like. That's great. That sounds like what I'm going to strive for. And what I particularly liked about Pauline, and always did, is that she did that with a sense of humor. And I loved that about her. I loved the fact that she was passionate about what she did, so brilliant in the way that she wrote about it and spoke about it, but also she was clearly enjoying herself, and she had a sense of humor about everything. What a great combination that was.
Could you give us an example of how Pauline held the room with her intellect and used her sense of humor to captivate people?
Sure. A recent example of that is not so much holding forth with her argument, but just being herself and yet controlling a room. And that was, she gave a lecture maybe a year or so before she died at Yale. And she was talking about her new book on ratification of the Constitution. And she was talking about ratification, and she was talking about actually the ratification project, that the people who were putting together the papers of the various states, and how honored she was to be one of the first historians doing a major work with them. And that in and of itself, I thought, wow, that's greatly admire a historian who gives credit to the documentary editors who are allowing us to do our work. But then she stopped and she recalled a moment when she was researching, and I can't remember which state it was that had ratified the Constitution. She was reading a letter by someone who was noting that he could hear the bells ringing outside because the Constitution had just been ratified in his state. And she said she just had to stop when she researched. It made her eyes fill with tears because it was such a real moment that she was taking part of by reading that on the paper. And what I loved about that was both that that was her response and that she told that to an audience of scholars at Yale. Again, she was just, very human and yet really commanding that room with her command of that material, and yet showing the ways in which it personally affected her.
Now, you've written that you really enjoy and admire Pauline's second book, American Scripture, Making the Declaration of Independence. And I wonder if you would tell us about American Scripture and why you enjoy and admire it so much.
Yeah, I really very much like American Scripture. And I guess for a couple of reasons. I mean, the title, I guess, gives away in part why. It takes a, capital F founding document like the Declaration and reveals the reality beneath it and how it came to be, and not simply by detailing a string of motions and corrections, but it gets beneath the politics to the actual reality of trying to figure it out in a room full of people and outside of a room full of people. And it's that latter point that I think particularly strikes me about that book. And it is that she's not just writing about a room full of guys. She steps back and she talks about this debate about how people around the soon-to-be nation were talking about independence. And there's this one particular chapter of that book called The Other Declarations, which I adore for that reason, because she's showing town meetings and people around the country really debating independence in a way that we just don't get in our history books. It's just not part of what Americans are taught when they're taught about the founding, about the Revolution, about the Declaration. And again, it's very Pauline-esque because it was the human reality beneath this grand historical moment.
Could you tell us how historians understood the making of the Declaration of Independence prior to the publication of Pauline's American Scripture, and how they understood it after the publication of that book? Because American Scripture, let's be honest, it was a really big deal when it was published. It was a finalist for the 1998 National Book Award for General Nonfiction.
Yeah, and I think it had multiple impacts. I think on one level, what she managed to do in that book, and I can vouch a very hard thing to do, is that she spoke to multiple audiences. So this is a book that had popular appeal, had a wide readership. If I give a public lecture of some kind and someone wants to read a book about the Declaration, I have no qualms about saying that. But that's not only the book and what's inside it, but it's an accessible, enjoyable read. That's not easy to do and say something new and interesting about the Declaration. I think that before that point, well, I guess it kind of gets back to what I said. I think before she wrote the book, people had two main paths that they went down to look at the Declaration. And one of them was a more intellectual path about traditions of thought and sources of thought and sort of tracking the reasoning and the logic and the cultural and political heritage that made up whatever ended up in the Declaration of Independence. The other pathway was kind of the nuts and bolts pathway, which was looking at the Continental Congress and looking at the series of events in the Continental Congress that led to the document and what led them to want to make the document and what impact did the document have. I think in recent years, there's been more work on the response to the Declaration, which is moving us a little bit beyond the high and the, I don't want to call politics low, but, the nuts and bolts low. And I think she hit a middle point in that book. She was not losing track of the very real story with very real people taking place, as I mentioned before, in the Continental Congress and outside of the Continental Congress. But she was also talking about the Declaration as a document and about what it means to Americans or has come to mean to Americans over time and how that differs from the place where it started. So she did a lot of things at once in that book in a way that I thought was very graceful and powerful.
So before American Scripture, were Americans really into the nuts and bolts of independence and how Congress declared it?
Well, by nuts and bolts, I mean the Continental Congress met on this date. I don't actually mean the nuts and bolts in the way that I discussed before about the other declarations. I think people were interested in the politics of that moment as part of the narrative of the revolution and part of the narrative of, the Continental Congress and its working. But I don't think that they were pushing beyond that in the way that she did in this book.
Pauline noted in her introduction to American Scripture that she set out to tell two stories: the story of independence and the story of the Declaration of Independence as a workaday document of the Second Continental Congress. Joanne, would you tell us about the Declaration as a workaday document of the Second Continental Congress?
Well, that's one of the things she does wonderfully in that book, is that although she's showing the process of creating it, I suppose it represents some of what made her history generally powerful, in that it's people trying to figure out these ideas in a very real way, in a way that gets beyond the politics of that moment, but that gets beneath the sort of intellectual traditions of it. So it's a workaday document, a human document that needs to be put together. She's trying to push past the very thing that she commemorates in the title to get people past the idea that in any way the Declaration is American Scripture, but instead that it was, a document a document that had to be figured out and that did a very specific thing and was intended to do a specific thing, and the scriptural components of it came afterwards.
Earlier, you mentioned that your favorite chapter of American scripture is the chapter titled The Other Declarations of Independence. Would you tell us about that chapter and why you enjoy it so much?
I do. I really love that chapter. I mention it a lot when I'm talking about the revolution, again, to my students or to public audiences, particularly because it provides an image and an idea that I think most people have never had. What I love about it is that it shows that, number one, the question of independence wasn't something decided in a room full of guys, that it was a colony-wide issue, and it wasn't just very high-level elite people debating it. It was lots of kinds of people thinking about it, debating it in town meetings. It was a very real problem. And one of the things that she shows in that chapter that was so striking is that a lot of these town meetings and places where they were debating independence came up with their own statements about what they felt about independence, which is what she means by the other declarations. So there were all of these other documents and conversations and debates and moments feeding into this larger debate. And for the most part, I think we didn't have any track of those other debates and declarations and conversations. It's a striking image, and it brings that moment to life socially and politically in a way that I think is always hard to do with anything having to do with the founding, and particularly with that document.
Yeah, some historians have said that that chapter really reveals that early Americans wrestled with the idea of independence.
Precisely. And she shows, again, the sort of human reality of that wrestling and the fact that it mattered, the fact that this is an issue that people cared about and that they had ideas about and that they, she just brings that striving, the sort of human striving and wrestling is a great word for it, to that moment.
You've also noted that Americans have treated the Declaration of Independence as a sacred text, which is something that Pauline's title alludes to. Would you tell us how Americans treat the Declaration as a scripture or sacred text?
I think this is true of the Declaration, and it's also true of the Constitution and of the Bill of Rights. And it's as a teacher who teaches the founding, it's kind of a phenomenon that I can't help but come up against, and that is people don't think of these things as anything other than sort of scripture, founding documents, that there are things that were sort of beamed down in a piece, that very brilliant people went into a room and created these great documents, and that they knew they were great documents when they were creating them. And they went on to become sort of, with no sense of contingency at all, great documents down through the ages. And, Americans, we like to treat our founding that way. We like to go back to it and see it as the sort of foundations of the things that we consider to be American in a kind of almost scriptural way. And so I think, generally speaking, people don't think about that moment as anything other than the creation of scripture, rather than the people with a very specific problem in front of them trying to figure out what to do about it. And not just people with a capital P, but specific individuals who came to that process with their own background and their own political ideas and figured it out. This getting past the scriptural component of it, I think, and getting past that component in the founding generally, I think is pretty important if we want to get people to really understand the process of wrestling and of compromise that really lies beneath America's founding.
How do you think getting past the fact that we Americans tend to treat documents like the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution as these sacred texts helps us better understand, not just the founding of the nation, but how we got to where we are today?
I think that's true in a variety of different ways. I sort of just hinted at one way, and that is we forget, I think, the thing that the founding generation were extremely conscious about, and that is that process matters. Right? The process of politics, it's the process of creating a constitution, the process of declaring independence that really fundamentally matters almost as much as the documents that result from that process. And they understood, although they had their own, throughout this period, there were polarizing political views. There were people who thought ill of each other. There were people who didn't like each other. There were any number of things you could say, I recognize that attitude. But this was also a group of people that managed to understand that they were engaged in a process that mattered. And so at least at a fundamental level, they had to be able to be in a room together and figure this out. And then step out of that room and figure it out on a broader level. And, I think we don't think about anything in our government having to do with process. Or certainly we haven't for a while. That might be different now. But I think for a long time, Americans have been taking the government for granted. It kind of just goes by itself, and you don't really have to worry about voting. And it started out as a good thing that was going to work, and it works. See, there we are. There we are now. And I think people have forgotten that's not the way it works. It is something that required and requires work. And I also think there's a kind of fundamental lack of knowledge about the founding generally and the Constitution specifically, and also the Declaration. But there's a fundamental lack of knowledge, I think, despite the sort of scriptural holiness of many of those documents. People don't really fully understand the process of government that those documents put in motion. And if we lose track of that, we really do lose track of our foundations.
With American scripture, Pauline took a capital F founding document, the Declaration of Independence, and revealed the reality beneath how and why that document came to be. Her research revealed that people both inside and outside the Second Continental Congress grappled and even wrestled with the idea of independence. What did independence mean? How would they declare it? Should they declare it? Pauline found that lots of people in the 13 British North American colonies were debating the issues. They met and talked in taverns and town meetings, and in the process of their debates, they came up with their own statements, their own declarations of independence, if you will, in which they defined what independence meant for them and their communities, and why they felt the 13 British colonies needed independence. Pauline also revealed that the Declaration of Independence may be seen as scripture by Americans today, but it was not seen as scripture in 1776. Instead, it was seen by the Americans who created it as a very specific solution to a very specific problem. It wasn't meant to stand for all times, but to stand at a very specific time. Knowing this about the Declaration and why it was created helps us see that we can come up with new ideas and new solutions for our own specific time. That we don't always have to try to make solutions created to solve 18th century problems work to fit our own 21st century issues and problems. And could the importance of this idea, the fact that we need to look beyond the sacredness we've imposed on our capital F founding documents, be why Pauline wrote her fourth and last book, Ratification, The People Debate the Constitution, 1787 to 1788? The best person to pose this question to is Todd Estes. Todd is a professor of history at Oakland University in Rochester, Michigan. He's the author of The Jay Treaty Debate, Public Opinion and the Evolution of Early American Political Culture, and of a book in progress about the ratification of the United States Constitution. Todd had many conversations with Pauline about her last book, so it seems like we should really ask Todd about it. But before we do, I'd like to share some information with you about our sponsor for this episode. Today's episode is brought to you by the Omohundro Institute, proud publishers of the William and Mary Quarterly, the leading journal of early American history since 1943. In partnership with the Journal of the Early Republic, the William and Mary Quarterly is publishing a special issue dedicated to investigating the American Revolution. Now, why did not one but two early American history journals decide to revisit the history of the American Revolution? Well, because as we've been exploring, the American Revolution wasn't one event, but a series of many events. Not one response to a one-sided issue, but a many-faceted response to a many-sided issue, and, well, there's still much more to discover. Take Elijah Gould's William and Mary Quarterly article, Independence and Interdependence, as an example. Gould explores what it meant to make a nation in the age of the American Revolution, and why the drive to do so dominated the era. To make his case, Gould looks at the ersatz Indian nation, the state of Muskogee, a place with its own army, navy, flag, vice admiralty court, newspapers, and even plans for a university. Created by adventurer William Augustus Bowles, the state of Muskogee was a sham, and also the product of its time. Why did everyone, colonists and colonies alike, want to get in on the nation-building act? Find out by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/WMQ promo, where you can order your copy of this special William and Mary Quarterly issue for a listeners-only discounted rate of just $10. Thank you for joining us, Todd. We're glad for the chance to be able to speak with you. As you know, we're exploring the life and work of Pauline Maier, and I wonder if you would tell us how you knew Pauline and first became acquainted with her work.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be on and be spending the time with you today. I think I first met Pauline Maier when I was a graduate student, and my advisor, Lance Banning, invited her to the University of Kentucky to give a public lecture. And, he had a little thing afterwards for his grad students and he and Pauline, and I just got to talk with her then and was very impressed with how nice she was for being, again, as a young grad student. She was an enormously big name in the field. I had read her books. We talked about them in seminar, and she was just tremendously interested in what other people were doing and very nice and encouraging. my first impression with her was a very, very positive one. And then over the years, I think I just saw her a couple times at various historical conferences. I remember there was a weekend conference once on James Madison and the concepts of the extended republic, which obviously she writes quite a bit about. And this was at the time when I was just beginning to get into my own research on the ratification and the Constitution. And over the course of a weekend with a bunch of other scholars, I had a chance to, learn from her at the seminar table, talk with her afterwards, and we really sort of struck up a friendship then because she was working obviously on her book on ratification. And we sort of exchanged some notes and then exchanged emails and then began to send each other various things to read and sort of each offered a sounding board to the other, which was for me just incredibly generous because, again, here's Pauline Maier, a tremendously powerful and important historian, very much talking with me, who at that time I had, my first book was done, but I was just coming to the project on ratification. So she was way ahead of me in terms of research and getting into the topic. But from that point on, we just stayed in contact and saw each other occasionally at conferences. We had, various emails back and forth. And then I think the last time I saw her, I presented a paper at the Boston Seminar in Early American History late in 2011, and she was the commentator on my paper. And then the next year, a bunch of us, myself included, were part of a William and Mary Quarterly Forum on her book. And that was the last sort of, contact I had with her, I think was probably in about 2012. And then the news of her illness and passing just came sort of out of the blue and was obviously devastating to all of us who knew her.
Since you did enjoy many conversations with Pauline about the ratification debates concerning the United States Constitution, which, as you pointed out, was the topic of her last book, Ratification, The People Debate the Constitution, 1787 to 1788, I wonder if you would tell us about her book, Ratification.
I think Pauline conceived of her book as being an attempt to go back to the documentary record and read what had been written and said about the Constitution, primarily in the state ratifying conventions, which is where obviously states called a special convention, they set the date, they elected delegates to the convention, and then they met at the stated time and place and debated the Constitution. Some of these were very lengthy meetings and conversations that spread out over the course of weeks. Some conventions like New Hampshire met, debated for a while, adjourned, and then reassembled later. Other conventions were very brief. They sort of met for a few days, then voted and moved on. So they varied tremendously, and Pauline's book is really an attempt to trace the debate over the Constitution in those ratifying conventions. So she focuses, not surprisingly, on sort of the biggest states and arguably the most important debates in places like Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, Virginia, and New York. But she manages to cover all the states, including Rhode Island, including North Carolina. And she focuses a little bit on what was being written in the newspapers, sort of the public debate over the Constitution. But it's really primarily a very finely grained study of what was written and said in the state ratifying conventions and how they were developed over time.
Pauline wrote Ratification in 2010. And at the time, she remarked that she was really the first person to write a book that focused on the story of the Constitution's ratification. Now, Todd, as you're really familiar with the history of the ratification debates, would you tell us how our understanding of these debates changed with the publication of Pauline's work?
Yeah, it was really sort of, I think, fractured and piecemeal. And I think a lot of it was simply due to the problem of not having a great source. We might want to talk more about the documentary history of the ratification of the Constitution project, which sort of made her book and will make my book and everybody else who writes on the Constitution possible. So I think that's one of the issues was simply the source material that made it very difficult to write about ratification, because prior to the documentary history, any scholar who wanted to research this topic would have to go to individual state archives, local libraries, public and private, and that's a tremendous amount of time and expense and effort to get around to all those places to do justice to ratification. And so I think previous books or studies of ratification, and there had not really been that many, had really sort of focused on the best known public sources. For example, obviously the Federalist got an enormously outsized part of the story of ratification in previous treatments because that's one of the things that was most widely known and most widely accessible. And then a handful of anti-Federalist writers, people that Pauline refers to as the critics of the Constitution rather than anti-Federalist. These critics also had a few handfuls of people like Federal Farmer and Brutus and some others whose works were treated. But the focus on ratification before Pauline's book had always been kind of scattered. People had done this state, or they had profiled a particular thinker or a particular line of thought. through some of the debates, debates over particular clauses of the Constitution or things like that. But really prior to her book, the sort of best source that looked at ratification as a whole project, the single cover that treated everything, was probably a book by Robert Rutland from 1966 called The Ordeal of the Constitution. And Rutland was a very, very fine scholar, but I found, and many other scholars have found, that particular book to be really frustrating in some ways because it's kind of episodic and it's not particularly thesis-driven. It's not particularly well documented or footnoted, and it tends to be very idiosyncratic. Whatever he was interested in, he spent a lot of time on. So I always thought that you got from that book a very uneven picture of ratification, and yet that was for a while the sort of standard treatment. And then over time, gradually, and a lot of this I think happened because of two events. The first was the publication of the documentary history, which made it possible for scholars in one source to find pretty much everything they'd want to read that was printed about the Constitution in 1787 and 88. And the second thing, I think, was the bicentennial of the Constitution in 1987 really just was a great flowering for historical research and writing about the Constitution. Primarily, at least at first, the convention itself in Philadelphia. But then eventually, there were a couple of very good collections that looked at state by state with different authors doing each chapter of the ratifying debates in those particular states. So that was kind of the state of things and where things stood when Pauline began her research. And I think her book really began to pull all that together, to draw on those previous treatments by historians, to draw mostly on the record of a documentary history, and to try to write in a single volume what those individual authors had done in particular states, but to kind of pull it all together. So I think that's what made her book so impressive. It didn't necessarily cover new material, except for those things that had been, unavailable before, but it did go over familiar material because we all know the story of ratification, but did so in a way that I think really brought it together in a strong narrative with a very strong interpretive argument as well.
You just mentioned something that Pauline wrote about, which was that the previous works about the ratification debates were episodic. The earlier historians really wrote case studies about how one state or one local area debated and ratified the Constitution. So since you know these episodic studies, and you know Pauline's more comprehensive study, what can't we see about the history of the Constitution's ratification if we only look at the process of ratification in these isolated case studies?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think this is partly why Pauline wanted to write the book that she did and write it in the way that she did. Because this really is, I think, a very important story of, as I like to think of it, in fact, as I'll be arguing myself in my own work, a political campaign. It's a campaign for or against the Constitution, with the goal being to get it ratified or to prevent its ratification. And I think what Pauline's able to do in this book, ratification, is really to focus on the change over time that occurs with this. I mean, she starts with the sense of crisis in the 1780s and the calls for a constitutional convention to address the problems of the Articles of Confederation and the need for a stronger, more effective government, and then talks about the convention itself, and then talks about the publication of the convention and the convention's work, and then, of course, tracks that right through the ratification debate. But it's a debate that goes on for about a year, really, from the fall of 1787 through the next late summer, and then even a little bit beyond if you're talking about North Carolina and Rhode Island. It's a debate that is in the newspapers, but also in the state ratifying conventions. And what she's able to do, I think, is to give us a sense of momentum, of changes in momentum, of sort of what we might call the sort of horse race of politics. Who's ahead? Who's behind? Is one side gaining? Is the other side losing? And how the debate changes from state to state, because new issues come up, or new objections are raised, or new arguments are made for or against that then sort of change the nature of the contest or the campaign. So I think what you can't get from a more episodic treatment is the sense of this as one story, of one narrative, as Pauline has sketched it out, that really takes on the sense of a narrative of a campaign with its ebbs and flows and its changes in momentum and shifts in direction. And so we get a sense of 13 separate debates taking place, but all within the context of one larger debate. And some states are more or less connected to other states so that they may be influenced by what's happening there, or they might not be. And I think that's part of what she's able to grasp. I guess the fancy word that historians use sometimes is this idea of contingency, that, this is not foreordained, this was not going to work out only in one way, but it worked out as it did because of what happened during the debates. And I think she's very alert to that, and she writes the book so that a reader coming to it is going to be able to read through her book. And even if they know how the story comes out in the end, that the Constitution gets ratified, they don't learn that until it actually happens in the course of the book, which was one of her editorial decisions she made as a writer that I think really gives some structure and really reinforces that sense of change over time as well as contingency.
Todd, a few times now, you've mentioned the documentary history of the ratification of the Constitution editorial project.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a project that Pauline gushed about too, when she talked about ratification, and she even gushed about it in the introduction to her book. Would you tell us about this project and why it's so valuable to our study of early United States history?
This is just a phenomenal gift to anybody working on the Constitution as a scholar, as a casual reader, as a researcher, because this project, which was started back in the 1970s at the University of Wisconsin with John Kaminsky and Richard Loeffler and Gaspar Saladino and a number of others who have since worked on it, this is a project that had as a goal to draw together everything published and a lot of stuff unpublished, that is private letters about the Constitution, and pull them together. So all those individual libraries, those local archives, those local libraries and collections, they gathered materials from those places, drew them together, and published them in book form. And much of that, if not all of it, is now also accessible online as well. So it's just an incredible resource for anybody interested in this period in any particular aspect of it or a particular convention. The books are divided by states, so there might be several volumes, say, I think there are 5, for example, on the debate in New York. And it tracks not only the New York ratifying convention, but it also tracks all the publications in New York, what was in the newspapers, what's going on behind the scenes and private correspondence. And it tracks this for all the various states. And then there are a number of volumes, about 6 or 7, that are devoted simply to commentaries on the Constitution from wherever they may have come from. People who wrote essays for or against, people who are advocating for a particular interpretation or a way of thinking about it. So it draws together and organizes in a variety of ways the wealth of materials that were printed on the Constitution. So anybody who is working on that subject can draw on this volume now instead of having to go around to individual states and traipse through archives and things like that. It's all gathered in one place. And this is, again, a massive project. It's up to, I think, 23 published volumes so far. They anticipate more than 30 by the time that it's over. And again, remember, this was started back in 1976, I think, is when the very first volume was published. So we're well into, 40 years plus of this project, and it's still going. So that's a sign, I think, of how thorough it is, but it's also a sign of how much time it takes to gather those kinds of things. But it makes possible the kind of work that Pauline did in this book, which really I don't think would be possible, or at least not in the same way, without it. So it's an incredibly valuable documentary history source. And again, it's the sort of thing that has lots of indexes, tables of content. You can sort of search it online. You can find a lot of things there that you need. So if you have a quick question about something, you can get to that. But if you're trying to read and study and craft a much fuller study, then it's got ample material for you there as well.
And you'll find ample material about local history, too. If you're interested in how your community or a particular community went about ratifying the Constitution, you'll find those debates in these volumes. I happen to know that they're incredibly rich on the ratification debates that took place in the city and county of Albany, New York. I mean, those 5 volumes on New York have all sorts of rich and interesting stories within them, and they really helped me write the last chapter of my dissertation.
That's correct. And the other thing about this is it's got lots of great editorial notes where they'll sort of summarize things or give you the background of a piece. And the other great thing about the documentary history, which is particularly useful for someone like me who's looking more at the newspaper campaign as opposed to what's going on inside the state conventions like Pauline did, what makes it really valuable is that this tracks where and how often each of these pieces was published. So one of the things we learned, for example, is how infrequently or how little the Federalist, for example, was actually published. Almost never outside of New York, and not that many times actually inside the state of New York. Whereas other publications like James Wilson's famous speech in the State House Yard in Philadelphia in October of 1787 was the single most widely reprinted piece of the entire debate. And you can track not only the ones that got a lot of circulation or the ones that didn't, but sort of everything in between. So it gives us a sense of how many people might have seen a particular document, how many people might have been exposed to a particular kind of argument. And I think in that sense, it's just invaluable work that helps historians as well as casual, serious readers of history.
Now, I wonder if you would help us understand how Pauline defined the American Revolution, because she was a scholar of the Revolution, and yet she wrote this big book about the ratification of the United States Constitution. Do you think ratification reflects a broadening interest of Pauline's in the Revolution? Or do you think the book fits right in with her ideas about the American Revolution?
I think it may be some of both. I think it does sort of fit into her sense of the Revolution. And I think it's interesting when you look at Pauline's scholarship, is that she really sort of starts off as a scholar looking in the 1760s and 70s at colonial radicals, at the idea of American opposition to Great Britain, and then move right through to her great book on the Declaration of Independence from 1776, and then on to this book about ratification. And of course, the project she was going to take up next was to be a study of the Bill of Rights, how that came into being, and also how that came to be known as the Bill of Rights. So I think one of the interesting points about Pauline's scholarship is that she really just kept moving forward through time, which I think is fascinating in several ways. And I think part of what it means is that so much of her scholarship, whether it's about the Declaration itself or about, in this case, ratification, is really grounded in not only her own study of the Revolution, but a sense of what happens to the Revolution as it unfolds. And I think the other thing about Pauline's scholarship on the Revolution, she was a student, of course, of Bernard Bailyn at Harvard. But I think she was always very interested, as were some of his other students, at this interplay between ideas and actions, between what people were thinking and what they were doing. And I think her work about the Revolution, the various books she wrote there, really focused on this sort of the complicated nature of how people thought and how they acted, and the fact that they weren't simply doing things because they had a set of ideas in their mind and they never wavered. Again, her studies are very granular, they're very well grounded, and I think that same approach is what she brought to the book on ratification. But I think her sense of how history works is that it's often not, purely ideas or purely actions or purely emotions or motivations, that it's always this interacting calculus of interest and ideas and actions and emotions and all kinds of other things. That's how she studied the Revolution. I think that's one of the hallmarks of her scholarship all the way through. And I think you certainly see that in the ratification book as well. So I think part of what she does in ratification is to take up that age-old question: what is the relationship between the Revolution and the Constitution? Is the Constitution in some way a rolling back or a betrayal of the Revolution, as some historians have argued, or is it a fulfillment of the Revolution, which is what the Federalists in 1787 argued, and what a number of scholars since then have argued as well. And I think without taking an absolutely irrefutable stance on either side of that argument, I think Pauline looked at those questions, examined them, and showed that for some people, the Constitution was a betrayal of the Revolution, which is why many anti-Federalists worked to defeat it. And yet for many Federalists, it was absolutely a fulfillment of the Revolution, of the hopes and ideals of the Revolution, to put the country on solid footing. And for many people, that explains their support for the Constitution. So I think in all of her scholarship, the American Revolution is always there. And so much of her scholarship, I think, focuses on how the ideas of the Revolution played out over time. And again, it's tragic that we lost Pauline so early, but it's also tragic that this happened before she was able to get fully into her study on the Bill of Rights, because that would have been a fascinating way of tying those ideas of rights as they're being debated in the 1780s and 90s back to the question of rights in the revolutionary movement of the 1760s and 70s.
If you enter a room full of historians and you ask them what the American Revolution was, you get a room full of different answers. And Pauline's work really reflects this idea of the long revolution, which not all historians subscribe to.
Mm-hmm.
So Todd, would you tell us about this idea of the long revolution?
Yeah, I think generally, people will define this in different ways, but I think one of the things that historians often recognize and think about with the American Revolution is that this is a movement that is very long term. And in fact, many people would argue it is still ongoing. It is still unfolding. And that all of American history in some ways could be interpreted as an attempt to apply the principles and ideals and goals of the revolution to everybody in society fully and equally. And that's obviously something that has not yet been resolved and is still an ongoing subject of debate and contention today. And so in that sense, I think there's a way in which the American Revolution is a long revolution, in that without ending in 1783 with a peace treaty or 1781 at Yorktown or something like that, this was really a very long, ongoing, unfolding event. And I think it's impossible to understand the history of the 1780s and the Constitution without understanding the impact of the Revolution and how that continued to linger. And then in the 1790s, even under the new Constitution, the Jeffersonian political party essentially is created as a way of trying to, in their minds, preserve the Revolution against the efforts of the Hamiltonian Federalists of the 1790s and the kind of system and country and future that they wanted to build. And so one of the questions is always, where do you end the revolution? And that's always a question that I ask my students to write on the final exam. Where would you end the American Revolution? Does it end in 1783 with the end of the war? Does it end with the adoption of the Constitution? Does it end in 1801 with the ascent of Jefferson and the Jeffersonian Republicans to political power? Does it end in 1815 when the United States wins essentially a second war of independence against Great Britain? Or is it again still ongoing in many ways? So I think the idea of a long American Revolution, again, even with that concept, you ask 12 different historians, you'll get 12 different answers. But I think that's part of how I think about it and how I teach it. And I think, to my mind, that's part of what has always driven Pauline's scholarship as well, the sense that this is an ongoing movement that can't be bracketed easily by saying, well, here's where it ends or here's where it stops. Because I think clearly so much of what happens, especially in the 1780s and 1790s and even after 1800, is really an attempt to sort of restore or bring back in some way the American Revolution.
The long revolution is the idea that the American Revolution was a movement that was very long term, that it's not something that's easily bracketed into start and end dates. Pauline Maier's scholarship reflects that she believed in the long revolution, and we can see this in the way that she studied the movement. Her study of the revolution began with radicals and their ideas in the 1760s and 1770s. Then she explored how those radicals and others moved toward independence in 1776. And finally, she took up that age-old question of whether the Constitution of 1787 was in some way a rolling back or betrayal of the revolution and its goals and ideals. Pauline believed that the best way to get an answer to that last question was to study the ratification debates, not just in one state, but in all 13 states. Looking at all 13 states allowed Pauline to track change over time in the arguments for and against ratification. And what she found was that ratification was not inevitable, and that the debates for and against it changed a bit between localities, states, and regions, and over the course of 1787 and 1788. Pauline's last book, Ratification, really is the first book where we can see the debates concerning ratification change between states and over time. Overall, Pauline left us with 4 important books that have impacted the way we see and study the American Revolution. But what will their longevity be? What impact can one historian have on how we view and study history in the future? Now, as we know, historians specialize in the past. They can't predict the future. But we may be able to make an educated guess at what the long-term impact of Pauline's work might be by chatting with a young, promising historian who will be working well into the future. Lindsay Travinsky is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University. Like Pauline, Lindsay studies the political history of early America. Specifically, her research explores the development of political institutions in the early American Republic, and she's working on a book that she's tentatively titled The President's Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution. So, why don't we go speak with Lindsay and find out just how much the work of Pauline Maier has influenced her work, and may influence her work still in the future. Lindsay, I know you never had the opportunity to meet Pauline Maier, but would you tell us how you first became acquainted with her work?
So in the first year of graduate school, as I began my research, I was doing research into the President's Cabinet and reading work about the Constitutional Convention and the state ratification conventions. And I was trying to understand what decisions had been made about what the presidency would look like and the president's advisors would look like. And I was trying to understand what the people at the time understood about those decisions and how they perceived those decisions. And so as I was doing that reading, I came across her ratification book that first year of school.
And when you came across Ratification and Pauline's other books, what was your impression or your sense of the importance of her work?
Well, the first thing that struck me was just how encompassing ratification was. It covered everything that I could hope to want to ever know and brought everything together in a way that felt like a great find to have in one book. But then the other thing that I realized as I continued my reading is that every other book I read and every other scholar I read cited her ratification book as the text on the ratification debates. So it was basically impossible to read any of the literature on the subject without coming across that book. And almost every single other scholar said that, you could not get away from it. You had to read it. And it was just absolutely pivotal in our understanding of what had happened.
Lindsay, You're an early career historian who studies the political history of early America. You just finished your PhD about a year ago, and now you're working on your first book. Would you tell us about what you're working on?
My work explores the creation of the president's cabinet in George Washington's administration. The cabinet is not in the Constitution, and no additional legislation has ever been passed to govern the interactions between the department secretaries and the president. So my book looks to uncover where this institution came from. And I argue that Washington pulled heavily on the Council of War practices he developed as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. And two other factors played a pretty large role as well: the executive councils in the state governments, and then the American conceptions of the British cabinet as a major source of corruption within the British government. And this work fits into sort of a broader approach to studying political institutions, which examines how political institutions developed organically in response to international, domestic, and constitutional pressures. One good example is Gautam Rao's National Duties, who was a guest on a previous episode of Ben Franklin's World. He definitely adopts this approach. And it's actually a tribute sort of to Pauline's work in that it's an approach to politics that looks at the realities on the ground and the decisions that people had to make based on the factors around them rather than ideology per se.
Yeah, I'd love for us to talk more about the ways that Pauline's work has influenced ways we currently understand and study the American Revolution. How has Pauline's work influenced the ways that you study early American politics? I mean, which of her works have you made the most use of, and what influence have they had on your work?
The book that I definitely use the most is the ratification book. It helps me understand what were the developments after the Constitutional Convention and how did the states come to ratify, and what were the anxieties and the concerns that people felt in the various different states. I think that's an integral part to understanding what the presidency looked like in 1789 when Washington took office, and understanding what the expectations were that he faced and what other office holders faced at the first time. I also use American scripture to help me understand the ties between the colonists and the king and the betrayal they felt, and how that shaped their understanding of what the president would be, in that they didn't want there to be a cabinet to corrupt the president like the cabinet had corrupted the king. I think also my approach to politics and political history is informed by Pauline's approach. It's not based on ideals. Washington and the department secretaries certainly held strong beliefs, but more often their day-to-day actions were the product of really difficult choices and sticky issues that were around them. For example, Washington was deeply loyal to the Constitution, and he entered the presidency committed to using the options that were outlined for him in Article 2, Section 2. So he visited the Senate to discuss foreign affairs, and he requested written advice from the department secretaries, both of which were outlined in the Constitution. But the practice of governing and the complex issues that faced the new nation and faced his leadership proved that those options really just weren't sufficient. The Senate couldn't provide the prompt advice on diplomacy Washington was looking for. It was a legislative body, and it wanted to debate an issue in committees before reporting to Washington. So even though it was much smaller than the Senate today, there were still some of the same issues about moving quickly. And when Washington was grappling with the neutrality crisis in 1793, he couldn't wait for letters to arrive at the secretary's offices and for them to compose a response, and then for him to then follow up questions. It was just way too complex of an issue that they were grappling with. So it made a lot more sense to try and come together, debate the issues with his advisors, and then come up with a decisive plan. And I think that sort of understanding of how political decisions were made is a product of her approach to politics.
How do you think your research and project would be different if Pauline Maier hadn't been a historian who left us with 4 books and many articles? What sorts of challenges do you think you would have encountered in your research?
Without the ratification book especially, the research in that book would have taken a decade or longer to recreate. So she provided such a gift to all of the historians following her who are looking to understand that process, because it's all in one place and it's an extraordinary work. She also is one of the first women to write about political history in a time when most historians that focused on political history were men. And so she provides an unbelievable role model in that way. And then the last piece of that is actually a model of writing and scholarship that I aspire to. Her personality and her sense of humor absolutely shine through her work. I never got to meet her, but from what I've heard, she was just such a funny and warm person. And if you read the introductions, especially in her books, they're hilarious. And her joy and her passion for history are incredibly clear in her writing. She also throws off a number of conventions, especially in her introductions, that make her work so accessible and helps the reader invest in the story and in her work. She tends to write her introductions in first person, and she occasionally slips in first person throughout the rest of the book, and it makes the reader feel like they're going along the process with her, and they understand the work that went along. And lastly, she didn't ignore the mundane and the humorous in daily life. Historians tend to focus on serious or anxiety-ridden events, which makes a lot of sense because those tend to be the most complex issues, and we're looking for answers to explain why certain things happen. But the historic actors that we focus on also experienced mirth and joy and love and frustration, and Pauline taps into that side of the historic experience. For example, in her ratification book, she tells an absolutely hilarious story about Washington getting ready to go to the Constitutional Convention in 1787. And he was supposed to leave around April 30th to go to Philadelphia. But the week before, he received news that his mother and his sister in Fredericksburg were really ill. So he rushes down there and finds that they're healthier than he expected. So he comes home, and he comes home in plenty of time to leave before April 30th, when he was supposed to go to Philadelphia to meet up with some of his Society of Cincinnati buddies. But instead, he spends days checking on his plantations, checking on the quality of the soil, and then taking his nephew, George Augustine, on a detailed tour of the properties and giving him really detailed instructions on how to properly plant peas and potatoes and how to write reports. And Pauline writes, the man was dawdling. And it's funny because no one writes about Washington that way, and no one says that Washington is dawdling, but it actually makes the story so much better because Washington was so disciplined and precise in everything he did. Yet he was totally procrastinating before leaving for the convention because he was worried about it and he didn't really want to go and he didn't know what would happen. And so because she put her finger on the fact that he was totally dawdling, it makes him and the story so much more relatable. And that's something I really aspire to recreate in my writing, that sort of accessibility and understanding between the reader and the subject.
What impact can the work of one historian have on how we view and study history? It turns out quite a bit. Lindsay revealed that Pauline developed an approach to studying how political decisions were made that she and other scholars use today. Pauline demonstrated that more than ideology, day-to-day actions and situations informed how the people we study acted and made decisions. And this is now a focus of study for historians. In fact, Lindsay uses this approach a lot in her own work. In addition to using and building upon Pauline's research and findings in both American scripture and ratification, Lindsay uses Pauline's approach to studying political decisions to better understand what the presidency looked like in 1789, and to better understand the expectations both George Washington and other office holders faced as the Constitution's new government assumed power. And this is to say nothing of the fact that both Lindsay and Todd told us how much time Pauline's work on the ratification debates has saved historians working on similar and related issues. Pauline Maier certainly left a large mark on how we study and understand the American Revolution and the politics of early America. But what was her greatest contribution? I asked this question of all four of our guest scholars, and this is what they had to say.
I think her greatest contribution is her attention to these individuals. She really wanted to understand, not only in the two books we've been talking about, but in other books, she really wanted to understand people in the 18th century and how they reacted to the events of their time, how they adapted, how they dealt with the kinds of burning questions that presented themselves to the period. I mean, not just when in the 1760s about resisting Britain, how far could one go, but later on with the development of the Declaration of Independence or with the ratification struggle over the Constitution, especially in the old revolutionaries. I mean, that's where we see it particularly. She really wants to understand these men as individuals struggling with events that present themselves for their attention.
Wow, that's a big question. I mean, I guess I would say two things. I think in all of her work, in one way or another, I like the word wrestling that you used earlier. In all of her work, in one way or another, she unveils history as a process of wrestling, of many different kinds of people in many different kinds of venues, wrestling with ideas and events. And she does it in a very human way. So she brings the past to life, and yet it's deeply grounded in the intellectual and political context of that moment. It's such a hard thing to do, and she did it so well. And in addition, she did that, and then she was capable of doing that for the broadest of public audiences. She was brilliant on documentaries because she could get on there, and she was funny, and she was lively, but she also really had something to say, and she said it powerfully and concisely. She was just a combination of things that isn't all that common, I think, in historians. And I think it was her humanity and her humanness and her humor, it's a lot of H's, were among the things that made her special. And I have to say, on a certain level, gave me permission to try and do the same thing.
I think if I had to pick one thing, it would just be the fact that she's been able so clearly to show how what's going on between, say, elite leaders and people variously defined as the people may actually have been, and how they were often reaching the same conclusions, perhaps at different ways and at different times, which really sort of complicates the question of, was the American Revolution about elites who led the nation and others simply mindlessly followed, or was it driven by the people from the bottom up who pushed elites in a certain direction? I think Pauline would argue that both of those are mistaken because they're sort of too simple, that it's a lot more of a complicated give and take. And I think when you look at her book From Resistance to Revolution about the colonial radicals in Massachusetts, you look at some of her other articles and book chapters that she's written about the revolutionary debate, you look at her study of revolutionary figures like Samuel Adams and others, you look at her book on the Declaration, which shows that very clearly, even as Jefferson and the Continental Congress were drafting the Declaration as we know it, there have been lots of local declarations coming out of town conventions and town meetings and local assemblies where people were debating the crisis with Great Britain, drafting their own declarations of independence, and then sending those on to Congress. So it not only gave Congress a sense of what people back home were thinking and that they would be on board with the Declaration of Independence, but it also shows that the impetus for that was not merely top down or merely bottom up, and it involved this sort of interaction between the two. And I think one of the continuities, one of the through lines that I think you can see with Pauline's work, right down to the ratification book, is this interplay between what we might think of as leaders and followers, between elites and the people more broadly. And I think an awful lot of her work tried to look at the connections between those and argue that it's not any major historical process like the revolution cannot be explained simply by it's the leaders who did it or it's the people who pushed them, that it really was far more complicated. And I think that's why for her it always involved going back to the sources, going back to the documents, going back to the writings and to the speeches to see what people wrote and said and thought. And that's the approach to scholarship that she had, I think, from her very earliest book and her work that she did as a Harvard graduate student, right down to the book on ratification.
For a long time, when historians studied politics and political actors, especially in the American Revolution, whether it be on the elite political level or the local level, the focus was really on political ideas. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And that scholarship is incredibly valuable. But Pauline showed the value of emphasizing the messy realities of politics. In her introduction to American scripture, she calls it the grubby world of 18th century politics. And I think that's incredibly accurate because, yes, these were men of principle and they had studied hard and they supported political ideologies. But the world that they lived in was real and dirty, and they had to make hard decisions. And they couldn't evaluate ideas and ideological principles in a vacuum. And instead, they had to grapple with the options and the limitations in front of them and do the best that they could to hold together really hard compromises. And so I think that approach to the American Revolution and the people of the 18th century, even though they're gone to us and they live in a totally different world, that is a type of existence that people have a better way of understanding and helps us understand a life that feels very foreign. And so that, I think, is her biggest contribution.
Pauline Maier, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This has been fun.
For more information about the work of Pauline Maier and our guest historians, visit the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/155. The clips you heard of Pauline Maier at the beginning and end of this episode are courtesy of C-SPAN. They came from her March 6, 2011 Book TV interview, and you'll find a link to the full interview in the show notes. Just as there is for every episode in the Doing History to the Revolution series, there is complimentary and bonus content in the OI Reader app for this episode. For this episode, you'll even find a couple of bonus audio clips that contain additional memories about Pauline Maier and information about her work. To download the free OI Reader app for your favorite iOS and Android device, visit your favorite app store or visit benfranklinsworld.com/OI Reader. Support for today's episode came from the Omohundro Institute, proud publishers of the William and Mary Quarterly, the leading journal of early American history since 1943. Be sure to visit benfranklinsworld.com/WMQ promo to get your copy of the William and Mary Quarterly's special joint issue on the American Revolution for the listener-only price of just $10. Finally, Pauline Maier believed in the Long Revolution. Do you? Let me know when you think the American Revolution began and when you think it ended. Send your answers to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.
Are you interested in the parts of history that remain a mystery? Do you want to learn more about the historical myths and misconceptions used to prop up false belief today? I'm Nathaniel Lloyd. In my podcast, Historical Blindness, I delve into all of these topics, sharing puzzling tales from the past and examining hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and misremembered events that provide insight into modern politics and religion. New episodes every 2 weeks. Find Historical Blindness on most podcast players and platforms.
As a longtime foreign correspondent, I've worked in lots of places, but nowhere as important to the world as China. I'm Jane Perlez, former Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times. In our third season of Face Off, the US versus China, we'll explore some of the biggest issues dividing these global powers today. Trump and Xi Jinping, AI, China's growing military might, and also robots. New episodes of Face Off are available now, wherever you get your podcasts.